The Resistance Report for August 30th, 2017. Now, I want to remind everybody that you can also watch the Resistance Report in our videos and live feeds on the new Reich Report page on Facebook Watch. If you follow the page, you will also get a notification every time there is a new video. Also, I want to let you know that tomorrow afternoon, we're going to have our first interview with Randy Bryce. Randy Bryce is the iron worker who is challenging Paul Ryan in his congressional seat, in his congressional campaign in 2018, and please be on the lookout. That's in the 1st District of Wisconsin. Be on the lookout for that. Now, let me just begin with an update on Hurricane Harvey, but what I want to do here, and what we try to do, is to put all of this in context, in the big picture. And I suppose, in fact, definitely the first thing I ought to talk about is the bravery and the courage and generosity of the people in Southeast Texas. I mean, not only are they brave and courageous, and not only are they people are doing an extraordinary job in terms of helping one another. But the other thing I want to say about all of these people in Houston and Southeast Texas and every other place is that this is one of the most diverse, racially, ethnically, and every other way, diverse places in the United States. I mean, you've got a lot of Latinos, you've got African Americans, you've got a lot of others there, and what we are seeing, despite the hatefulness that we saw in places like Charlottesville with that demonstration and the violence there, despite a lot of the hatefulness we are beginning to almost take as normal in America, when the going gets really rough, what you see is people who begin to really work together, who decide that they are going to come together because they care about each other. And this may sound a little bit hokey to some of you who right now feel very, very cynical about America. But there is a great deal of good out there, and we can see this in Houston and in Southeast Texas and wherever this terrible hurricane is going. You know, there's just a lot of generosity. And so I want to thank everybody who has been going through this real disaster, this terrible nightmare in Houston, Texas, and in Southeast Texas, and in Louisiana, for what you are doing for each other, what you are doing in the sense of the common good. There are a lot of cynics out there, particularly in Washington these days, who said, but the Americans don't care about the common good. Well, you do. And whenever you despair that America has become something that's selfish and angry and hateful, just remember that kind of behavior. Now, in contrast, when members of Congress from Texas return to work next week, the fallout from Harvey is going to follow them back to Washington. The cleanup is going to be very expensive. I'm sorry to talk about costs, but we have to face the fact that the federal spending on Hurricane Katrina totaled about $120 billion, and Hurricane Harvey has caused at least as much damage so far, probably more. Now, this is not chump change, Trump change, chump change. So one of the things that we have got to pay attention to is the dollars, $120 billion or more. Where is this going to come from? Where is it going to? I mean, in terms of the federal government, the National Flood Insurance Program is already more than $24 billion in debt. Now, I want you to just remember that $24 billion. National Flood Insurance is $124 billion in debt. The program has a $30 billion borrowing limit. And with massive new claims that are going to be coming in from Hurricane Harvey, congressional action is going to be needed to raise the ceiling from $24 billion. Now, the interesting thing about the $24 billion is that $24 billion, it turns out, is just about the proposed cost of building Trump's entire wall along the southern border of the United States. So you've got the Trump wall. I should say number 2 here. And what are we going to see? This is the wall. And here is the person who is sponsoring the wall. Just so you don't misinterpret the person I'm just drawing. This is the wall, and there is the person who is behind the wall. Who wants the wall? Hello. Now remember, Trump threatened to shut down the government if Congress doesn't approve initial funding for his wall. He is still obsessing about his wall, as at least a half dozen deaths were reported across Texas and tens of thousands of Texans fled their homes on Monday. Trump spoke of the drug scourge from Mexico. Quote, tremendous drugs, he said, are pouring into the United States at levels that nobody's ever seen before. The wall will stop much of the drugs from pouring into this country and poisoning our youth as we need the wall. Well, this is exactly at the same time, by the way, that Southeast Texas is under a deluge. Now, before Hurricane Harvey, Republicans were eyeing deep cuts to disaster relief to pay for Trump's wall. And now they're going to be forced to abandon the proposal and look for cuts elsewhere. So how do we pay for Harvey and also pay for the wall and for everything else that government has to do, and also the $54 billion increase in national defense that Trump wants? Now, by the way, the budget that Trump submitted to Congress, number 3, Trump budget. What about that Trump budget that he submitted to Congress? How, if we are going to connect the dots, how does this dot connect? Well, the budget that Trump submitted to Congress cuts disaster relief for floods, cuts the budget of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It also cuts the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Community Development Block Grant Program, which, after Katrina, helped homeowners rebuild. So if Congress goes along with Trump's budget, Houston is going to be in big trouble, and a lot of other places are going to be in big trouble. Now, just to make matters even worse, in a way, today Trump offered his vision for overhauling the United States tax code. Tax overhaul. And what do we know about Trump's tax reform? It shouldn't be called tax reform. Every time you hear Donald Trump talk about tax reform, watch your wallets. I mean, it's a combination of deep cuts for corporations and for big deep cuts, tax cuts for big investors, and deep tax cuts for the wealthiest. But why exactly should corporations and the wealthy get big tax cuts at the same time that we have natural disasters, at the same time we've got huge needs around the country? And by the way, in case you forgot about it, I mean, what is this all about in terms of providing disaster relief? That is called social insurance. Hello? Now, connect the dots further. Hurricane Harvey, Trump's wall, budget cuts, tax cuts for big corporations and the wealthy who do not need it. I mean, one thing we know about corporations these days is that they are making record profits. Shares of stock, the stock market has never been better. The wealthy are wealthier than they've ever been in the history of this country. Why, at a time when we do need help all over the country, and we also need to shore up Medicare and Medicaid, why do we need big tax cuts for the wealthy? Trickle-down economics, hello, doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We've tried it before. Ronald Reagan tried it. George W. Bush tried it. Trickle-down economics is a cruel farce. It is cruel because it hurts a lot of people, and it is a farce because it doesn't work. Now, another dot to be connected, remember we're trying to connect the dots, has to do with unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. Now, an estimated 600,000 of them live in Houston, the largest number of any city in the United States except New York and Los Angeles. So, are they getting help? Are they getting shelter? How about others in southeast Texas? How about others in Louisiana? There are a lot of undocumented, unauthorized immigrants there. Political leaders in Houston have sought to reassure unauthorized immigrants, their families, that immigration enforcement would not be conducted at shelters and food banks. But here's the problem. The U.S. Border Patrol has not suspended operations at checkpoints in Texas and also at checkpoints in southern Louisiana. And unless it suspends operations and you are an undocumented immigrant or the child of or in a family of undocumented immigrants, are you going to go to the shelter? Are you going to go to a food bank? Are you going to make yourself visible in some official capacity to officials in their official capacity? Now, one final dot I want to connect, and I'm running out of dot space here. And that is that Houston is the center of the nation's petrochemical industry. And I just want to talk a little bit about the environment. Now, the petrochemical industry just went through one of the biggest mass shutdowns in history, because the petrochemical industry in the United States, you go to southeastern Texas, go to Houston, just south of Houston, that's where it is. It's all refiners. And they had to close down. A lot of them are underwater. But when you close down an oil refinery, you release plumes of sulfur dioxide and toxic chemicals. I mean, that's just what happens when they shut down. A lot of these are causing or will cause, unfortunately, hopefully not, but we know from what has happened in the past, they cause health problems, particularly downwind. And emissions-wise, it's the same thing when those refineries start up again. There are also a lot of toxic chemicals, a lot of things that are emitted into the air more than usual. The real problem here, and let me make this as clear as I possibly can, the real problem is that the refineries were allowed to operate so close to residential areas in the first place. And why were they allowed to operate so close to residential areas? Because Houston, Texas, has no zoning regulations. Now, the people in Houston are wonderful people, and they help each other, and they're doing wonderful things. But the business leaders and the petrochemical industry and others in Houston have this kind of free market ideology that says markets know best. So if you want to put up an oil refinery right next to a population center, that's perfectly fine. By the way, earlier this month, Donald Trump reversed an Obama order requiring that infrastructure projects, now that's including roads and bridges, everything else, be designed to withstand the consequences of climate change, such as flooding and rising sea levels. Experts in climate change, coastal management, environmental policy, they begged the Trump administration to maintain the federal flood risk management standard for climate resilience. But what happened? Politically powerful real estate developers and builders lobbied for overturning Obama's order, and they got their way, thanks in no small part to industry allies inside the Trump administration. Oh, and by the way, does anybody believe, really, that the severity of Hurricane Harvey was unrelated to climate change? I mean, climate change scientists, climate scientists, anybody who knows about climate, have said any individual hurricane you can't blame on climate change, but Harvey was more intense than it would have been in the absence of human-caused warming, which means, and has meant, stronger winds, more wind damage, larger storm surges. It's not just in Houston, it's all around the United States, but it's all around the world. As Harvey approached Texas, another epic flood pummeled South Asia. A ferocious monsoon put a third of Bangladesh underwater and has left more than 1,200 people dead across that country, and in India and Nepal, with millions homeless. And so, what's the United States' response to all of this climate change? We're pulling out of the Paris Accord. That's Donald Trump's brilliant solution. How does all of this tie together? Now remember, the purpose of this report is to connect a lot of dots. And we've connected a lot of dots here. The budget, Trump's wall, tax reform, undocumented immigrants, the environment. Right-wing ideology is responsible for a lot that has gone wrong in this country over the last 30 years. And we see the dangerous impact of those ideas on the situation in Houston, zoning laws that benefit corporations over people, senators who want to cut disaster relief to pay for tax cuts, the power of big industries to shape policy. Nonetheless, the people of Houston have triumphed in the face of this disaster. That's the real story here. Their kindness and generosity should give us all hope. And now it is time for your questions, which I haven't seen. Daniel Sprouse, is Harvey disaster relief funding likely to slow down funding for that damned wall? Daniel, my guess, honestly, is that the Republicans they're going to have to give Trump something so that Trump maintains face. He's made such a big deal out of this thing, but they're not going to give him $25 billion to finish the wall. They're going to give him maybe a little bit for a down payment, just to get it started, so that he can say, well, I've at least begun to build my wall. They're going to be budget negotiations. They've got to be fast, because this budget deal has got to be made before the end of September. That is, on September 30th, Daniel, on September 30th, the federal government's going to close down if it doesn't have a continuing resolution or some sort of budget. So you got a lot of things compressed into September. I expect there is going to be a little bit of money for the wall. There's also going to be disaster relief. Even though you've got, in Texas, you've got these senators who voted against Hurricane Sandy disaster relief. You remember that. Because of ideology. Brad Jenkins, what is up with Trump's tax plan? Well, Brad, as far as I can tell, nothing is up with it. I mean, what Donald Trump presented today was the outline. He is not going to get into details because he doesn't have any details. He's going to wait for the Republicans to try to figure out what the tax plan is. And that's going to be a big problem, because you've got one set of Republicans who don't want any kind of a debt. They don't want to add to the debt. They don't want tax cuts that are going to add to the debt. They are fiscal scolds. And then you've got another group of Republicans who really want to play to the wealthy and big corporations. They are patrons, and they want to give a tax cut. It's this fight between the deficit hawks and the corporate Wall Street tax cut group that's going to really dictate the contours, the details of this tax cut, not Trump. Trump is going to take credit for it. and he wants to set himself up to take credit for it. But frankly, I don't think Donald Trump cares about any policy issue. He just wants the policies to be made so he can take credit for them. Susan Dunlop, how do we stop Trump from pilfering our coffers? Is that what you asked? How do we stop Trump from pilfering our coffers? Well, I suppose, Susan, I mean, that's part of a much larger question. I mean, how do we stop Donald Trump from basically pilfering everything? I mean, it's not just our government, and it's not just kind of tax breaks, which are going to help him, by the way, hugely, for reasons that we will get into once we know the details, but I'm absolutely sure they're going to be enormously helpful to his business and his family. But you're also presumably talking about using his office for personal gain. The conflicts of interest, I have never seen anything like it, and they are very, very well documented. The Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, prohibits foreign governments from giving presents or anything of worth to officers of the United States, particularly to presidents of the United States, and he's raking it in. The Trump Hotel in Washington alone has generated $200 million in profits since Donald Trump went to Washington, and he's getting a piece of that. So how do we stop him from raiding our coffers, you ask? Well, we impeach him. Number two, we get him out on the 25th Amendment. Nobody's got actually out on impeachment or the 25th Amendment. Or we and I think it's beginning to happen, he's being neutralized. The forces, the courts, the press, even Republicans, big business, a lot of major forces in this country are just kind of closing him off, trying to make him irrelevant. Okay, Kat Roca. What recourse will there be if and when Trump fires Mueller? I frankly think, Kat, that if he fires Mueller, and he will try to do that, I don't know when. I would say probably if he does it, he's going to do it over the next 2 months, 3 months, as Mueller closes in on Trump's financial deals. Trump has said he doesn't want Mueller to touch those financial deals and to investigate. Trump has sort of drawn that red line. I think that Trump will try to fire Mueller, and there's no law to stop Trump from firing Mueller, but there's going to be a huge public outcry. I think more than almost anything that Trump has done, even firing Comey. And a lot of Republicans, I think, by that time will see that they have got to divorce themselves even more from Trump, and that may even get the ball rolling on impeachment. I wouldn't be surprised. Michelle Williams, when will Democrats address the real problems of corporate lobbying, universal health care, campaign donations? Michelle, there are some Democrats and some Democratic candidates who are beginning to address those problems, the structural problems, widening inequality, enormous concentrations of wealth and power in this country that make it almost impossible to get anything done for the common good, for all of us, rather than for a small group at the top. In fact, I will be interviewing one of those Democrats very, very shortly, and I hope you watch. But the Democratic Party is sort of a shell. I don't think there's really much there. What's necessitated, what's required is that you, Michelle, and everybody who is watching this right now, and I and everybody else, we take responsibility. We have got to, and we are already beginning to, mobilize and organize and make sure that the Democratic Party, or whatever it's called, I don't, at this point, want to limit it to the Democratic Party, really does begin to respond to we, the people. And that may sound rather quixotic at this point in time, but Michelle, it is the only way we can go. I don't obsess about the Democratic Party, but do obsess about activism. Many of you, particularly after 7 days plus of Donald Trump and the Trump administration, Many of you tell me that you thought it would be over by now, this nightmare. You have marched, you've demonstrated, you have given money, you've been more active than you ever have been, and you are some of you are tired and discouraged, and you say, I can't believe this nightmare is going on. All I can say to you is that everything that is good that has ever happened in this country has required time and effort, and the only silver lining on this terribly dark cloud called Donald Trump and the Trump administration is that it is causing Americans to come together, to organize and mobilize, and to recognize that this is our democracy. Us. So, I hope you tune in to our interview coming up, and I will see you for another Resistance Report next Monday. Have a great weekend.